Welcome to the Less Doing podcast, where you will learn how to start living more by doing less.
Let me help you optimize, automate, and outsource your entire life so you can focus on doing the things you love.
Now here's your host, Ari Mizell.
I'm here at campaign headquarters for the Andrew Yang 2020 campaign.
Hey man, welcome.
Thank you. Things feel very calm here.
Well, it's just because we're doing work over here, and like the team has a ritual where when there's an interview on, because of acoustics, like everyone calms down.
Even so, though, I feel like I think a lot of people probably don't have any sense of, unless they've been involved in a political campaign of some sort. I think they don't really have any sense of what happens behind the scenes and what's really involved.
Yeah, you definitely have to be in it to understand, and it reminds me very much of a startup in many respects.
Yeah.
But the wild thing is that it's a startup with like a defined target date. So when you see many of these campaign teams, they like run, and then the date, brick wall, and then the whole thing disbands. It's kind of incredible. Not to say, I mean, we haven't experienced the latter part but it's like a startup with an end date.
Well, and there's sort of two end dates, I guess, really for you, right? Because one is getting the Democratic nomination, and then the other one is the big one, right? So
yeah, exactly. So some of the benchmarks upcoming are really the first primary votes get cast in January 2020. And the majority of presidential candidates will get washed out in January and February of 2020 when Iowa and New Hampshire vote. They'll probably wipe out 80 to 90% of the candidates.
But how many are there right now?
Right now there are two of us. But by the time...
There's only two? Running for Democrat?
Yeah. Right now there are only two of us that have declared.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But we know that number is going to surge to probably a record number.
Yeah.
20 to 30. And so of those 20 to 30, let's call it like 15 are going to get wiped out by February of 2020.
Yeah, okay. And then in talking about this like a startup too, how much are you taking into account competition, right, versus just like playing your own game kind of a thing?
You know what's fun about our campaign in particular is that it's very much playing your own game, which is true of most of the good startups I've been a part of.
Sure.
Where if you're constantly trying to keep tabs on a particular competitor and then trying to distinguish yourself from that competitor. I like growing from a low base myself in both business and in politics, it turns out, where your job is just getting the word out and conveying what you're doing, and then just growing. And only when you become really mature do you start distinguishing yourself against competition.
It's a fair assessment, I'd say. And one of the things that I always see when we're working with different companies at different levels is that regardless of the industry or the location or anything, at particular revenue points, people tend to deal with the exact same issues. So in my world, at least from like 1 to 300,000, the focus is on sales, and 300 to 1 million, the focus really needs to be on systems. So I would imagine that you see some similar issues in growth as you get bigger and bigger.
Yeah, very much so. And we're in the sales stage ourselves, where the vast majority of people don't know who Andrew Yang is or why I'm running for president or why I should be president. And so there's a lot of getting the word out and messaging.
Well, let's see what we can do to help. So why are you running for president?
I'm running for president because I'm convinced that we're going through the greatest economic and technological transition in human history. And the reason why Donald Trump is our president today is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, the swing states he needed to win. And my friends in Silicon Valley know that we're about to do the same thing to millions of workers in retail, call centers and customer service, truck driving and transportation, which is the most common job in 29 states, fast food, and on through the economy, and that it's going to be disastrous for more and more Americans. And when I started an organization called Venture for America that creates jobs around the country. We helped create about 3,000 jobs. And I realized we were pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom, and that we need to think and act much, much bigger and faster as to how we're going to help America get through this transition. Not to be too dark about it, but I see even something as terrible and tragic as the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh as part of the same overarching narrative where as we blast away middle-class livelihoods and paths to the future, then people become more prone to leaders like Donald Trump and hatefulness.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a completely valid connection. So but you don't really see automation as a bad thing, obviously.
Well, I think automation is driving an historic need for adjustment, and that right now we're leaving it to people individually to figure out that adjustment, and it's not going well at all. And so I would be very much pro-automation if we were broadly distributing the value gain such that everyone had cause to celebrate and be happy about it. But instead, again, if you look at truck drivers, if there are 3.5 million 49-year-old men who drive trucks for a living right now, and then you say, hey guys, great news, the trucks are going to start driving themselves, they're going to go from making $46,000 a year to zero, 10,000. It's like their next alternative is going to be very, very dramatically inferior to their current job. And so if you look at them and say, well, automation is a good thing, progress, that's just so abstract. So I'm very pro-progress. I'm a serial entrepreneur, but I think we need to start getting real about what we need to do to help more people share in the value gains and have reason to celebrate.
So my main feeling about automation and replacement of humans in certain jobs is that if it can be automated, then to some extent it's not necessarily something that a human being really could fully engage with, because obviously they had a job, they're doing what they needed to do, but at some point if the computer can do it, then is that a truly fulfilling job for a human being? And there must be, and maybe it's idealistic, but there must be some better utilization of that resource.
Well, that's the ideal, man. It's just the market does not agree with you. So there's a quote in my book about how if you were to make a video game the same as the cashier's job, you'd think this is the shittiest video game ever made. That's like punishing. But then if you make it a job, everyone's like, oh, it's like dignified and important. And obviously we're going to automate away millions of cashier jobs. 30% of malls are going to close in the next 4 years. And so I would agree with you that if you can automate it, we should automate it and we should celebrate that. Particularly because right now the vast majority of Americans are not doing jobs that they're particularly pumped about.
Yeah.
By the numbers.
Yeah, and so that's something that I always think of is there must, again, I know it's idealistic, there must be something better for that person to do. So what do you suggest then systemically to help that truck driver that gets displaced by the Uber truck?
Yeah, by the Uber truck. Which is like just a few years away. So the big moves we have to make, the reason I'm running for president, is that we need to start thinking much bigger and more dramatically about how we're going to redefine work and value in this society. So the first big step is a Freedom Dividend, which is what I've rebranded universal basic income, because
Nice.
Americans really like the word freedom. The test's much better. We tested a bunch of things.
And they don't like socialism, so.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is it sort of bifurcated along political lines, where if you're progressive, you like it no matter what we call it. But if you're conservative, you hate it unless it has the word freedom in it. So being very practical, we said, well, Freedom Dividend seems very popular. So every American gets $1,000 a month, free and clear, starting at age 18, onward to 64, and then Social Security kicks in. And if you think about what $1,000 a month would do in a country where 57% of Americans can't afford to pay an unexpected $500 bill, it's really dramatic, where it would improve mental health, physical health, stress levels, graduation rates, nutrition. It would bring down domestic violence, hospital visits, anxiety and depression. It wouldn't obviously fix all those things, but it would make it significantly better. And it would also alleviate some of the economic and social tensions that are leading to hatred and disunity and strife. It's the single biggest change between a mindset of scarcity, which is what most of America labors under right now, and replace it with a sense of abundance. So that would go a long way to help that displaced truck driver. But we have to think bigger still, which is if you look at the things, and this is to your point about, hey, wouldn't it be great if Americans or humans could do jobs that could not be automated? So if you think about the things that the market right now will either under reward or fails to recognize, and you're a parent, you've got how many kids?
4.
Yeah, I know you're an overachiever. So I've got 2 young boys. So, but you know that the things that the market will ignore or undervalue include things like parenting and caregiving, arts and creativity, journalism, increasingly, environmental sustainability, public goods, volunteering in a community, involvement with a religious organization, or otherwise. So the market will essentially say, hey, these things don't have any value. Yeah. But we know we need much more of them. And certainly that former truck driver needs more of these types of things in order to be connected and have a sense of purpose and structure and fulfillment. So the goal would be to try and create a new economy around some of the measurements that we should be using to measure our own well-being. Because right now GDP is the shittiest measurement ever for our well-being. This GDP is just going to keep going up. And even the inventor of GDP, Simon Kuznets, said this should never be used as a national measurement of well-being, which is now what we use it for. And so if you can imagine where we redefine economic well-being to be things like how our kids are doing, how much we like our work, mental health and freedom from substance abuse, how our elderly are faring, levels of criminality and recidivism, and then reorient our economy towards things that would end up creating many more human forms of work. We essentially have to refashion a marketplace that rewards work that only we can do. It's very ambitious, but it's 2018. We invented GDP in 1930. I mean, we can't just ride GDP off a cliff, which is what we're doing right now, 88 years later. And so we start with the freedom dividend, but then we start measuring what matters and redefine economic success along those lines, and then start rewarding those behaviors. But we have to move very fast, because even now, labor force participation is down to 62.9%, the same levels as Dominican Republic and El Salvador. Right now in the U.S., year 10 of an expansion. And almost 1 in 5 prime working age men between the ages of 21 and 30 has not worked in the last 12 months. And again, that's here in the U.S. right now, year 10 of an expansion. So we need to start thinking and acting much, much bigger to try and redefine work in ways that will enable us to keep pace with robots, AI, and technology.
And speaking about being idealistic, right? So you think, though, that you believe that if you give somebody in a bad situation $1,000 a month, that they're going to spend it on the right things.
Well, most Americans are going to spend it on day-to-day expenses at this point. Like, if you look at the numbers, most of them are going to spend it on paying down their debt, or car repairs, or putting food on the table for their kids. I mean, right now Americans are working often 2 or 3 gig or temp jobs to make ends meet. 94% of the new jobs created since 2005 have been temporary gig or contract jobs that don't have benefits, particularly healthcare. So if you put $1,000 in their hands, for the most part, it'll just help people survive and get by. But on the high end, you would end up providing a catalyst to entrepreneurship and creativity by enabling people to pursue interests that have been inside them the whole time. I
mean, don't get me wrong. There's clearly, and I'm as 2 people who live in New York, we have I think a sense of just how expensive it is to live in New York, and how it's not as expensive to live almost anywhere other than New York. But I know that there's certainly people who could completely survive on $1,000 a month and not have to work a minute in the month to make that work for them as an individual.
Well, there's certain parts of the country where $1,000 goes much, much further.
That's what, yeah.
But even in those parts of the country, the poverty line in the U.S. is $12,770, and so you're still below the poverty line if all you're getting is $1,000. But yeah, there are people who could get by, particularly if you had some communal living situations, and it's one of the things I think that universal basic income would help bring about, is that if you have 6 people get together and say, hey guys, $6,000 a month, we could clean up that house and whip it into shape and start gardening and do a bunch of things, and that's where we ought to be heading, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. On the one hand, I obviously, to me, it feels like a CSA in a farm. Every share that goes into it is covering the basic operating expenses of that farm to be able to do what they do, and anything beyond that they can sell and make a profit. So it makes life a lot easier, right? But so I'm also thinking though about that person who has been incarcerated and they're out, and maybe they're in an area where drug dealing and drugs are really common and crime is really common. So what's to stop? I mean, there isn't anything, I guess, to stop them from spending that money on drugs or on other nefarious activities.
Well, you look at the data, and I tend to be very data driven. There hasn't been an increase in spending on bad things wherever people have gotten this money. So that's very encouraging. Yeah. And right now people are coming out of jail with nothing. And then what are the odds of that person then lapsing into bad habits? Or, no, it's going to be hard to find a job because you're an ex-con, and then, you get into drugs and bad things right now without the money. Whereas if you have the money, you can at least say, okay, like, I'm not going to starve. I have some value to society. People kind of like having me around. Like, I'm not, like, it's something, it's a reason to stay out of jail too. Because when you go to jail, you don't get the freedom dividend. And if you wind up running afoul of the criminal justice system due to drug use or something like that, then you also don't get the money, because the money ends up going to treatment for drugs. So they're actually like more powerful incentives to avoid bad behaviors. Certainly now, if you come out of jail with nothing, expecting you to keep your head up and your nose clean, like, seems harder.
Especially with so many companies that won't hire ex-cons as it is. So how will we fund this?
Well, the big change we need to make is we need to start harnessing the gains from artificial intelligence and advanced technologies, because the big winners in this era are going to be the trillion-dollar tech companies who will benefit the most. And so...
Why? Why is that?
Well, so if you think about the benefits of AI and self-driving cars and trucks, the leaders in that field are companies like Google / Alphabet / Waymo and Uber and Amazon. And so those companies are great at not paying a whole lot of tax.
Right.
The Amazon move didn't make any money this quarter, no taxes. The Alphabet move is it all went through Ireland, like no taxes here in the US. And so the trap for the US is that these companies are going to soak up more and more work and value, and the public's not going to see much of a gain, even as the needs get higher. And so we need to join every other industrialized country in the world and have a value-added tax, which would then give the public a tiny slice of every Amazon sale and Google search. And because our economy is now so vast at $19 trillion, up $4 trillion in the last 10 years, even a relatively moderate value-added tax, half the European level, would generate almost $1 trillion in revenue here in the US. So that plus existing welfare spending of about $800 billion a year, plus all of the value gains from the fact that you'd grow the consumer economy by 12%, and then you'd end up getting back about a quarter of that new economic growth in tax revenue, plus the cost savings from things like healthcare, incarceration, and homelessness services, and the fact that you'd have a healthier, better educated, less stressed out, more productive population. All of that would pay for a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month. We have the resources. We just right now are thinking too small.
Why 1,000, by the way? Because I know 12,700 is poverty. Does it have to do with that?
Yeah, so it pushes you right below the poverty line, but it's not enough so that you're going to quit your job in most situations unless you really want to, or your job's exploitative in some way. It's based on a plan that was studied by the Roosevelt Institute and was proposed by, among other people, Andy Stern, the former head of the SEIU. And so it's someone else's plan that I have appropriated, but it's been studied, and I looked at it as something that would have a really dramatic impact on the lives of tens of millions of Americans, but is not enough to distort the labor market.
And obviously, wanting to do this is one thing, actually making it happen is another, and it feels like in some ways this could be trying to steer a cruise ship with an oar, to make this change, because there's, besides the legal aspects and political aspects, there's the mindset of people to understand this shift.
Yeah, so a neuroscientist in Seattle said to me that the enemy of universal basic income is the human mind, because we've been programmed for resource scarcity, particularly where money is concerned. And that is the change we have to make. But I have to say, now that I'm running for president, I see what the path forward entails, and it's doable. Like you don't need a constitutional amendment to pass universal basic income. You just need a congressional majority. It passed the House of Representatives in 1971 under Richard Nixon. Martin Luther King was for it. Milton Friedman was for it. 1,000 economists signed a letter saying this would be great for the economy and society. And the reason it didn't become law was that Senate Democrats wanted a higher income threshold than was being offered. And that income threshold was about $30,000 for a family of four. I mean, it was significant, but the Democrats wanted more, and then the moment passed. But then one state passed something just like universal basic income in 1982, where now if you live in Alaska, you get between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked, from a petroleum dividend. And so when I go to Iowa and New Hampshire, I say, hey guys, Alaska's doing this with oil money. What is the oil of the 21st century? And then many of them respond correctly. It's technology, it's data, it's AI, it's the rest of it. So in Alaska is a deep red conservative state. And that petroleum dividend is now wildly popular. Libertarians and conservatives love it because it's about autonomy and decision making, and it's created thousands of jobs. It's improved children's health. It's reduced income inequality, and it's so popular that no politician can touch it. So there are precedents here in America. You do not need a supermajority. You just need 51% of Americans to stand up and say, I'm an owner and citizen of the richest, most advanced society in the history of the world, and I can vote myself a dividend.
So then those people, for example, the truck driver who loses his job to automation and now is getting $1,000 a month, what do you think happens to that person?
Well, so the goal is that, none of this happens like immediately, in the sense that right now, if you start getting $1,000 a month, you can still drive your truck until that job dries up in like 3 or 4 years. So then when that job dries up, then you're like, okay, I've got a bit of a nest egg. I go home. I'm not going to die. I'm getting the Freedom Dividend. And in an ideal world, that worker then finds something else to do in their community, something like become a mechanic, become like an air conditioning repair person, or like does something that there's still a need for. And there is a massive need for middle skill labor in this country. I mean, there are 15 million unfilled job openings around line repair and high-end manufacturing and a bunch of other things that we just don't have people trained to do. Not to say, and this is one thing that infuriates me, if you look at the success of government-funded retraining programs in the U.S., there's essentially no value in government-funded retraining programs where the fail rate is more than 80%, and that it's just a waste of money most of the time. So there are a lot of politicians who walk around saying, we're going to retrain. We're not going to retrain millions of Americans to do some new wonder job. And that is true for the vast majority of truckers, too. I mean, we're talking about 49-year-old men who've been driving trucks for years. There's no reason to think that they're all of a sudden going to become coders or something ridiculous. And so...
Shopify experts.
Yes. So for many of these truckers, when they go back, it's going to be a very, very tough transition. And if you look at it right now, if you look at the displaced manufacturing workers in the Midwest, about half of them left the workforce and never worked again. And then many of them started drinking themselves to death and killing themselves, where now 8 Americans die of opiates every hour. And suicide rates have spiked to a point where now life expectancy is declining in this country overall. I mean, it's getting that dark. So it is not to say that that trucker is going to just go home and, be pumped. I mean, by the numbers, he's likely to start drinking and do some bad things. But in an ideal world, he goes home and is like, okay, I've got a nest egg. Let me see what else there is to be done. And then because everyone in his community is getting $1,000 a month, and we're in the midst of trying to create more touch points in the economy for people to be able to do good things that are not a 9-to-5. Like, let's say that trucker then looks up and says, okay, like I can now do this thing to help my neighbor and get various credit for that. I can volunteer at this like local youth center or Little League or coaching, and then maybe I get some credit for that. Now I can give people a ride and get some credit for that, and then start trying to build a more robust economy around things we need more of in society. That's the ideal world, and that's the Herculean challenge we have to undertake. The thing that frustrates me is people look at it and be like, oh, well, what are you going to do? I mean, if we do nothing, that trucker is going to go home and kill himself and then eventually start, some of them are going to revolt because 350,000 of them own their own trucks. And 80,000 of them are ex-military. So if you think these people are just going to go home and be like, oh, well, like that's that. I mean, the odds are much higher that they're going to band together, say, fuck this, say, hey guys, let's go protest, block a bunch of highways with their trucks, and have at it. I mean, that's a much more likely scenario in the next 5 to 10 years. I want to say also only 13% of these truckers are unionized, so that there's not much of a collective bargaining resolution to be had.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting for a number of reasons, but one of which is it almost feels like you're trying to take a group of people who are not risk takers and turn them into risk takers by removing the risk.
Well, right now, business formation's at multi-decade lows across the country. People are moving across state lines at record lows. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have to try and supercharge dynamism in this country. And you and I are serial entrepreneurs. We know that most entrepreneurs have a mindset of abundance and possibility and optimism, which is the opposite of what most Americans are experiencing out there. So can you increase a mindset of abundance and optimism if you put $1,000 a month into people's hands? Hell yes. It's like there's so many people who'd be like, oh, wow, like now that this $1,000 is coming in, like maybe I can start that business I was thinking about doing. Or in many cases, maybe I can pursue a creative endeavor that I've had in mind. I mean, like de-risking it. Because a lot of the entrepreneurs I know came from really strong families. And so the truth is, in the background, they knew if they failed, they could always go home and lick their wounds. They could go get another job. They're educated and strong. We have to put more Americans into that sort of mindset.
Yeah, it's a tall order in some ways. So shifting a little bit, we've been a country for a couple hundred years, and we've had a large diversity of leadership, diverse in the fact that they've always been relatively wealthy white men. So that's got to be something as an Asian American, right? You have to be considering that this is pioneering in a lot of ways, and maybe the country wasn't ready for Hillary. Maybe there are a lot of different reasons for that, but this would obviously be like a first, and it's probably something. It must be an elephant in some of the rooms that you talk in.
It's been a lot of fun. I mean, one applause line I use is that the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes numbers.
Yeah.
And I am in some ways like the opposite extreme, where
sure,
like I'm very, very into the data and into trying to solve the root causes. The root causes to me for Donald Trump are the fact that we blasted away millions of manufacturing jobs and retail jobs, and we're going to keep on ripping through the economy in this way. And it's going to spur tons of hatred and violence and xenophobia and racism and misogyny and the rest of it. So we need to think and act much, much bigger and more boldly about what the future can be. And my Asianness, I think it's been a plus, truly, because people think I know what I'm talking about when I talk about technology and business and the economy. It's like they think, oh, this guy is like a smart Asian guy. He must know what he's talking about. And that I haven't experienced any like racial animus or hostility. I mean, I am talking to Democrats in Iowa, New Hampshire, and like people I think are very open. But there is a really tough transition ahead for this country and I was speaking to a group of Asian Americans over the weekend, where I said that I think Asian Americans have a particular role to play because this country is transitioning towards becoming majority minority in 2045 or so. And there's a very limited history of dominant economic or political ethnic groups voluntarily sharing or relinquishing power. It's not like a normal thing to happen.
Right.
And so this period is going to be very, very tough. And I think Asian Americans have a particular role to play and there's another Asian joke, but like a friend of mine said, like America needs an Asian American president because it will irritate everybody a little bit, but it won't make anyone too upset. And so my goal is to be the guy who comes in and cleans up some of the messes, the really deep systemic messes that are causing problems in this country, and then get out of the way afterwards. So that's, I'm a very proud Asian American, but like it truly hasn't been like a major issue when I've been out there stumping.
I think that's an excellent approach to it. I don't know if you've seen the the Sacha Baron Cohen show, Who is America at all?
Yeah, I think I saw.
I mean, there's still some very, very backwards people in this country.
Yeah, and the great thing about running for president, the way I am as a Democrat, is that I just need to win over 40 or 50,000 Iowa Democrats. It's like I don't need to win over every single American or conservative or someone who looks at me and is like, un-American or something along those lines.
Well, I mean, in every single election, right? Half the country loves the president, half the country hates the president. So,
yeah, and that's one of the problems we have to work to overcome. It's going to be, I mean, there's no silver bullet, but I do think that the opposite of scarcity is abundance, and that's where we have to head.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think a lot of people, at least in the political sphere, talk about that. You see that in our circles a lot, in entrepreneur circles, but you just never hear that word come up.
Yeah, and this false sense of scarcity is going to kill us. And I have to say, Republicans have really won this argument so big time against Democrats. Where Republicans are like, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And Democrats are like, here's how we're going to pay for it. Here's how we're going to pay for it. And then when Republicans are in charge, they're like, $1.5 trillion tax cut. Like they don't care about how to pay for the thing. And then Democrats are still like, here's how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to do it. We have to be like, you know what? We're the owners of this country. If we invest in ourselves, we're going to get back many, many times the returns, which we will. Just like a good company says we're going to invest in our people, as a society, we have to look at ourselves and say we are the biggest assets and ownership class of this country. And if we invest in ourselves, we win. And that's there are plenty of resources to go around. We are the richest and most advanced country in the history of the world. We also have the global reserve currency and a lot of flexibility that we have to make use of while we still are integrated as a society. We don't have limitless time to get this done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's still large untapped resources in this country as well.
I mean, you and I hang out. I mean, there's so many untapped resources. I mean, you and I hang out on both sides where it's like you see that there are some people who are doing phenomenally well that if they were to take a haircut, they would barely notice. And then on the flip side, we know that there are all these people that could be contributing in various ways that never have a shot at all. I mean, there are inefficiencies on both sides.
Oh, completely. How, as you're growing the campaign now and growing what you're doing, what's sort of the big challenge for you right now? I'm not talking politically, but like really logistically, business-wise, as a startup. What's the big challenge for you in the campaign?
Well, it is really fun most all the time, and it feels very familiar. Right now, the challenge is like I compare myself to like an indie band that people when they discover they're like, oh yeah, that Andrew Yang guy, he's got like some great.
You like Yang?
Yeah, yes, he's got some great tracks. And we can't win as like the indie band that people love, but not enough people have heard of. And so when you talk about like the major operational logistical challenge, it is how to get our ideas out to the broadest audience possible fast enough. I mean, in a way, it's funny. It's like because it's like a startup with an end date. Like you don't have them. You can't plan around your own calendar. You have to try and make it happen. And so the challenge is really growing big enough, fast enough, and without setting your hair on fire, doing something dumb. Like that. It's interesting that we live in such a sensationalist time too, where our president's a narcissist reality star who just had like a bigger public image than others. I mean, one of my real fears and concerns is that Democrats lose this next election. And if you look at the figures who are the front runners, I mean, it's plausible that Trump wins again. And Trump said something that we then quoted because Trump said like he's dying to run against all these people. And his one fear is that some newcomer comes out of nowhere that no one's ever heard of and runs against him. And so our challenge is being that newcomer that grows big enough, fast enough to be able to beat him in 2020.
It's a fun puzzle.
It is a fun challenge and puzzle. So like we grow every day, but then you always ask yourself like, is that big enough, fast enough? And so you have to be a disciplined operator and believe in the message and what you're doing, while also keeping your eyes on the prize.
So last question is, what are your top 3 pieces of advice for people to be more effective?
This might be controversial, but number 1 is to not listen too much to what's going on out there. Like there's some people who are, it's like, oh, you got to like stay informed and like read every last blog. I'm certainly not that kind of operator. It's like you have to pay the most attention to what you're doing and your team, and trust that you're going to find your tribe and find a following. So number 1 is focus on yourself first, and don't get too caught up on whether or not, quote unquote, you're doing the right things or you're at the right conference with like the right people. I mean, a lot of the times when you go to these conferences, they're terrible. It's like, so number 1 is focus on your own stuff. That'll help make you more effective, in my opinion. Number 2 is to work with people that you really enjoy working with, and that if you have an opportunity to be able to fashion your own team, just like, because like when people enjoy who they're working with, everyone is more effective, and you end up with a stronger culture. And then number 3 is to write, and that's like to write stuff for yourself. Because I look back on stuff I wrote a while ago and like get tons of value. It's like a window into like a different point in time. And then sometimes you write something, it's like, oh, I should send that as an email to the team. Or like, oh, now that I'm running for president, it's like, oh, I should like make that into an op-ed or whatnot, where there's something magical about writing in terms of organizing your thinking. So those would be my 3 pieces of advice.
Those are excellent. So where can people find out more and support your race to the top?
Yeah, if you have an interest in building a new economy that revolves around human beings, go to yang2020.com, or you can just Google my name, Andrew Yang. At this point, I've dominated every other Andrew Yang on the internet. But we need your help to build this campaign and this case as big and fast as we can, because humans are going to lose over time unless we define the race into something that we can win. And so again, we invented GDP almost 100 years ago. We can invent new measurements and start measuring what matters. And everyone who's listening to this as a business person knows that when you start measuring something, you get more of it. So we need to measure the things that we need more of and then push our economy in that direction.
Thanks for listening to the Less Doing podcast. At Less Doing, we help entrepreneurs who have opportunity in excess of what their infrastructure can support to set up systems and processes that empower a team to ultimately make themselves more replaceable. That way they can optimize, automate, and outsource everything in their businesses in order to be more effective. If you want to find out more about Less Doing, the podcast, the blog, the books, and all of the wonderful programs we offer to help you get from where you are to where you know you want to be, go to lessdoing.com/podcast and check out our OAO blueprint so you can get started today.